A Colombian peace deal years in the making, struck after decades of bloodshed. But is peace between the government and FARC rebels in Colombia under threat? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Right-wing parties which are opposed to a peace deal with Marxist FARC rebels actually won the most votes in Colombia's recent elections, the FARC picking up less than 1% of the vote. So how fragile is this peace, and what will it take to bring any kind of stability to the country?
A controversial peace deal brokered with former rebels, a divided Congress where main parties have failed to secure a majority while right-wing parties are on the rise and paramilitaries remain active. Colombia's fragile peace is facing ongoing challenges. Will its citizens see longed-for stability any time in the near future? For over half a century, a conflict has raged between the left-wing military group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, known as the FARC, and the Colombian government. 220,000 were killed, 25,000 disappeared, and nearly 7 million Colombians were displaced. But at the end of 2016, President Juan Manuel Santos pushed through a new deal that hinged on a simple trade-off. The FARC has agreed to lay down its weapons in exchange for the chance to participate in political elections.
Desde hoy soy candidato a la presidencia de la República, representando a mi partido, la Fuerza Alternativa Revolucionaria del Común, y me comprometo a encabezar ese gobierno de transición que genere las condiciones para el nacimiento de una nueva Colombia. Un gobierno que representará por fin los intereses de los pobres en Colombia.
In summer 2017, the former rebels handed over their arms to the UN. A stockpile of more than 8,100 guns, 22 tons of explosives and thousands of grenades and landmines, signalling what many hoped would be an end to the violence. But this new peace is already being tested. The country is battling corruption and a rising right wing. At the height of its influence, the group controlled as much as a quarter of the country's territory. And the landscape still bears the legacy of the conflict. Landmines are buried throughout the mountainsides of Colombia, the second highest number in the world after Afghanistan. For now, the FARC has suspended campaigning, citing threats to its candidates and the ill health of its leader. But in reality, the group's political ambitions could be thwarted, not by current obstacles, but by a legacy of violence that Colombians won't soon forget.
And joining us from Barcelona, we have Kristian Herbolzheimer, Director of the Colombia Programme at Conciliation Resources. With me at the round table, we have the journalist Javier Farje, Jacques Arnold, a specialist in Latin American affairs, and Felipe Roa-Clavijo, who researches Colombia at the University of Oxford. Very warm welcome to all of you. Felipe, let me ask you first, as the Colombian at the table, do we have a peace? Do we have a peace process, or is everything falling apart?
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for the invitation. We have an early peace process with a long road ahead. What we've built so far as a peace process have marked historical moments, from the demobilization of FARC, laydown of weapons, and the constitution of the FARC as a political party. Yet there's a long road ahead in terms of building and accomplishing all the commitments.
And the number of casualties has gone down hugely.
Definitely, and that's one of the first outcomes that we need to celebrate.
So what happens, and anybody can jump in on this, what happens when we see Londoño, who was going to be running for president, head of the FARC, former FARC man, saying, listen, I'm not going to take part because I'm not very well, or perhaps, as some have suggested, it's because he was going to get hammered in the elections, the right wing were going to bulldoze him out the way. Yeah, you
Well, he was hammered in the legislative elections in March, when they got, I think, 52,000 votes for the Senate and 32,000 votes for the Deputies Chamber. That means they got...
1%.
1%, they didn't get a single elected member. They have 5 senators and 5 deputies because that's part of the peace process. But they didn't get anyone elected, and the opinion polls were very, very dire for the FARC because although they have some support in some part of the countryside, they are hated in the cities because of the extreme violence that was exercised by the FARC during the years they were active. So maybe he was aware that at the moment, unless they build a political base which will enable people to understand the message, and we mustn't forget that he's moved from the Marxist-Leninist rhetoric of the FARC to a more social democratic sort of speech, just to make it more attractive to the Colombians. But I think part of the decision to leave was the fact that he was going to be hammered in the presidential election.
Kristian, I'll come to you in just a moment. Jacques, I know you wanted to jump in, but I've got a question for you in a moment. So what did you want to say first?
What I wanted to say is it really is evidence that Colombia is moving on. It is absolutely revealing that the FARC had a vote on that scale. But far more important than that, it shows that the Colombian people are adjusting to the new world and their future and voted accordingly.
So let me ask you this one, because I'm not quite clear on it. You think 1% of the vote was staggering in what sense? That it was so small?
It's staggering that it was so tiny.
Yeah.
And I think what it demonstrates is the support, or lack of it, that the FARC has always had. But far more important than that, it shows that the Colombian people are looking forward and looking to the future and trying to put the conflicts and FARC behind them.
So let's go to Kristian, talking about conflict resolution, etc., etc., and talk about the disparity between the feelings in the richer parts of Colombia, let's say in the cities, and in the rural areas where FARC had most of their support in the first place. Is it still very much a divided country? Is there resentment?
In many senses, yes. FARC was not completely defeated militarily, but in terms of public opinion, they lost the battle many years ago. And that will take a long time, if ever, for them to recover. We now have a country that is at the initial stages, as Felipe said, of a peace process, which still needs several years. I mean, after 5 decades of armed conflict and polarization, we have just experienced 16 months of agreement implementation. And already, despite the internal polarization in Colombia, it has achieved remarkable developments from an international and comparative perspective. No rebel organization in the world had ever decommissioned so fast as FARC combatants. We're talking about 6,000 combatants in only 7 months. And that's a world record. And Colombia is actually beating world record in a number of other ways in this early peace process.
So what's it going to take for it all to stay together? Because you have a big right-wing influence now within the parliament. You have candidates come up in the presidential election who don't want to see this happen. You have a former president, Uribe, who hates the idea of the peace process. What is it going to take for it to hold it together?
I don't think that if Iván Duque, the candidate of Uribe, wins the presidential election.
The right wing, yeah.
The right wing.
Yep, yep.
First of all, the parliament, that means the Senate and the Deputies Chamber, they are quite divided. It's true that Uribe's party is the biggest party, but by no means they have the majority. They're going to have to make alliances in Congress to be able to rule the country. But even if the candidate wins, he said it very clearly, we are not against the peace process per se, because it would be going back to the bad old time. They can't afford to do that.
But he wants peace on their terms.
No, he says basic. But first of all, the peace process, the peace treaty had 10 changes from the original one demanded by the Uribe camp. But the issue is that he said, look, my problem is not whether grassroots former FARC people campaign. My problem is to have killers in parliament. That's something that we are not going to accept. But he's not against the peace process per se.
Do jump in.
Yeah, I will add that leadership is important, and whoever takes on the president office.
We've got elections later on this year.
We have elections next month, coming up within a month, and what's going to be important is the leadership that's going to be taken from there, whether it is supporting or not the specific agreements on the peace process. But I come back to your question on how is it going to hold together, and I think civil society participation has played an important role there before, during, and after.
And yet. Okay, go back to 2016. There was a referendum, a plebiscite, on the idea of peace with FARC, and the people said no.
Well,
allow me to finish. Then what happened was it was pushed through with a few changes through the parliamentary system. There was never a second vote, and some people feel let down that they weren't consulted on what they're now seeing.
But at the same time, at the next day of the referendum, thousands of people came out to the street, both who voted yes and both who voted no, to ask for an agreement as soon as possible. So as you can see, there was an interest in peace, but in terms.
I'll let Jacques come in, but I know you were itching to say something. Have I got this wrong?
No, but because this is our whole point, it's obviously sticks in the gullet of that 99% plus that there are 10 representatives in Congress.
99% plus who?
Of the Colombian voters.
Yeah.
Sticks in their gullet that in their Congress, regardless of democracy, sit 10 FARC representatives who were not elected. That sticks in the gullet of any Democrat. But the facts of the matter is them being there was part of the price to pay to get peace and an end to the sordid
were the Colombian people let down?
Through.
But they weren't given a final say in what happened?
well, if you talk about the referendum, you're absolutely right, but only 37% of people eligible to vote went to the polling stations. That means that when the 50% of those people voted against, a bit less than 17% of the whole people who were eligible to vote voted against the peace process. Of course, the threshold was very low anyway, so that was the problem with that referendum. So if you have a very tiny percentage, because it's tiny.
So you don't think the people feel let down by the fact that they didn't get to vote on what eventually came to play?
No.
The people have moved on. I think that's what the elections prove. They're looking to the future. Colombia voted predominantly for the right wing, is totally in parallel with the rest of Latin America. Look at Argentina, look at Chile, look at Peru, although they have some interesting recent developments. Latin America has turned to the free enterprise right wing for its future, and it now rests on those politicians not to let the people down.
Tell us whether why it all started in the first place, and whether the reasons for the conflict, having begun and lasted so long, still remain, or whether they have been addressed.
Well, there are root causes, and then there are consequences of the root causes and the conflict that spiraled and created a negative process. The root causes are essentially covered by the peace agreement, and it's related to access to land and access to politics, essentially. And that's what the peace agreement tries to solve. At the same time, of course, after 50 years of conflict, there are additional consequences of the conflict, and the main one are the massive human rights violations, for which a special jurisdiction for peace has been created.
Yeah, this is like the Reconciliation Council, isn't it?
It is. The reconciliation is part of it, but this is an extremely complex and at the same time politically controversial situation now of finding out who committed what and who will be held accountable.
Yes, and it has the right to recommend that there should be criminal proceedings. Yeah.
There's going to be criminal proceedings, and now it's a discussion also in Colombian society. What do we understand by impunity, and what do we understand by justice? And it is a highly controversial issue, but I think it's also a very healthy dispute Colombian society is having. I mean, it will take time for society to come to terms with what happened. I think it's also important to put in perspective. In Northern Ireland, 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement, there hasn't been any truth commission or any proper mechanism for dealing with the past. Colombia is trying to do it immediately after signing a peace agreement, and that's, of course, very difficult.
Very dangerous too, perhaps. What do you say?
Dangerous too, but Colombia needs to be commended for that effort. And I think that's one of the very fascinating developments in the Colombian peace process.
Javier?
Although there is an impasse in the way Northern Ireland is run at the moment, we know that there's a disagreement between the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, and Sinn Féin, the two main parties there. Nobody would suggest that there would be a return to violence because of that. That is exactly what's happening in Colombia at the moment, as far as I'm concerned anyway. People have started to get used to peace. Therefore, they can freely choose whoever they want to vote for, whether you like the right or not. It doesn't matter. That's totally irrelevant. The fact is that people have started to get used to peace. I visited Casanare, which is in the central north part of Colombia some time ago, where BP operates. They had two problems there. One, they had to spend a great deal of money in security because the FARC attacked them all the time. And second, they almost ran the town. They built the Justice Palace and there was no presence of the state. That has changed completely since the peace process happened. That means that the investments that Colombia are going to get is absolutely crucial for this peace process to remain. And many people have started to benefit with that. But as he mentioned rightly, the violations of human rights are only in 2017, more than 85 activists of human rights were murdered in Colombia. And that is a problem that the government has to address to prevent the situation.
Have the inequalities that were one of the reasons for the conflict to begin in the first place, agrarian, agricultural inequalities, have they been addressed?
No. There is
I'm asking this because I want to know whether we've gone far enough to go beyond.
I mean, the land inequality is at the very root of the conflict, and it still remains that Colombia is one of the most unequal countries in terms of land distribution, only comparable to Haiti, for example, and therefore, that's something that will need to be addressed. But it's not only land inequality, it's also economic inequality. And as long as there are these urban-rural divides, showing this huge gap between what the cities have achieved and what the countryside have achieved, there won't be progress.
Do drugs come into this? Because Colombia was known 30 years ago as the major Central South American hub for drugs. Perhaps it's moved on to Mexico now, although I think a lot of cocaine is still produced in Colombia. Do drugs come into the peace process per se? Jacques, what do you? Because Obama upped aid by $450 million to try and help eradicate the drugs. Now Trump is saying, hang on, with all these drugs that are coming to America, I may get rid of that.
And it remains a serious problem, but isn't the primary problem. Basically, the primary problem is the economy, the very things you were talking about just now that need to be addressed. And in a free democratic era, Colombia can get on with that. And that's the value of the current situation.
Addressing the drugs problem is the fifth point on the peace agreement agenda between FARC and the Colombian government.
So Jacques, if President Trump says, I'm not going to give this money to Colombia, would that massively hinder what is being done?
I think it wouldn't be helpful. He's got a friendly government that is trying to tackle things. It wouldn't be a helpful move just at the moment.
Well, he needs Colombia to attack Venezuela anyway. So
yeah, well, Trump
at the same time,
in Colombia. I'm sorry,
Kristian, do jump in. Yeah, we couldn't see you waving at that point.
If I may jump in here. So obviously, I think we could all agree that there is limited risk for FARC taking up arms again, or any new government seeing FARC as enemies and try to fight them militarily. That part is probably gone. Now, there's a number of challenges internally in the transition from FARC, from the bullets to the ballots, if we want to put it that way, from society to adjusting to being used to see FARC, who have been depicted as terrorists, and being part of normal political landscape in the country. And there's a number of other sources of violence in the country, fueled by drugs very often, but not only. But criminal activity is still quite high. And there's another remaining armed group, the ELN, with whom there are peace negotiations. At the same time, the international arena is also very influential. And that is right now probably mainly the US and Venezuela. Both countries have been very important and very instrumental to support the negotiations and reaching the peace agreement. And they remain critical for sustaining the momentum towards peace. Of course, situations in Venezuela are not helpful and are not encouraging. And it is only to be hoped that the Trump administration will not change its explicit support to the peace process, because that would potentially also be damaging.
Let me throw this one out here as we look at some of the problems, some of the obstacles to come. Presidential election coming up. Claudia Lopez, candidate for the Green Alliance, says it's easier to disarm FARC than to combat corruption in Colombia. And a lot of people are really fed up with that. What happens next with that?
Well, I think once you address the conflict, which was at the top of the agenda, and you start building a more peaceful society and steps for getting there, then corruption jumps up to the top of the agenda, because many things are unveiled throughout the process of this transition into the peace agenda.
What happens after FARC when a group such as the ELN steps in? It hasn't stepped in on the scale of FARC, but it is there saying we are still prepared to carry out violent acts. I mean, could it morph into?
Therein lies the problem. If issues are not addressed and if people turn to terrorism, they used to flock to FARC, they would flock to the ELN.
Yeah, but the thing is that the difference that the ELN cannot fill the void left by FARC because they are far smaller.
Far smaller.
So in that respect, in the military front, if you like to use that expression, which I'm not happy with it, but anyway, it explains that they are not likely to cause as much trouble as the FARC caused. But they would be a...
So they've been hobbled in a sense.
Yes.
The violent elements
Yes.
have been hobbled like a donkey by agreeing to a peace process out of which they may not get what they wanted in the first place.
But not only that, if the reforms that you mentioned before that shouldn't be needed in the countryside do not come soon, the ELN could be strengthened by that, and that could be a risk for the peace process.
That's a phenomenon we've seen not only with ELN, but with other criminal bands that have emerged after FARC. So we're in the regions where the FARC left, new criminal bands have emerged, and they are taking on those territories.
And would you include in that the right-wing paramilitaries?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, definitely, definitely.
And what's being done about that?
For years, for years.
Kristian?
The state has a big challenge. It's a huge country, and state presence in the rural area is essentially historically been military presence, if at all. There's no doubt about the government's will to deliver, but the government's capacity to deliver quickly, because everything is urgent, is much more challenged. And it's a difficulty that Colombia faces, any other country as well. I mean, moving from words to deeds, from the paper, from the agreement to the implementation is unfortunately a long path and a very complex one. And that's now creating expectations that are very difficult for the state to meet.
The candidate I mentioned, Claudia Lopez, let me ask you this, Jacques. She goes on to say that now peace is a reality. Colombia has a buoyant middle class that demands high-quality education, better services, and a fair political process. Well, it's pretty much what everybody would want in a peaceful society. What are the chances of it moving there in the next 5, 10 years?
I think there are very good chances, because the war and all that involved has been disposed of. And again, I go back to the elections show that the Colombian people are actually looking forward. And that includes dealing with issues that you've just mentioned.
But it needs a buoyant economy. How does it go about getting that?
But the
This is one of the things.
Colombia has always grown.
That's
the thing, isn't it, about Colombia?
It is, the interesting thing is the Colombian economy has indeed grown throughout the period of the Troubles. Yeah. So now with peace added to the mix, wow, what opportunities they've got.
And what are those opportunities?
The opportunities of growth, which gives
in what particular areas, so we can, those of us who are interested, can keep looking?
Resources, oil production.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, now they can operate in those areas where the FARC were active without having to worry about that.
So geographically, they'll have more, yeah.
So that's...
And also with a countryside clear of FARC, and eventually from ELN, the opportunities for agricultural development.
You've got to go in and clear the mines first. Is that happening?
It is happening, and it's come down to a very satisfactory level so far.
And it should be mentioned, it's happening with the assistance of British technical and financial aid.
Kristian, biggest challenges in the next 5 years, what do you think?
National reconciliation. I think Colombians have been fighting not necessarily with weapons only, but in politics and in society largely. Each one trying to impose their own vision of a future. And I think Colombia has reached a point now where it's time to draft a common vision for a future where there's space for everybody. without hatred and without exclusion. And that will be difficult. That takes time, but that's fundamental to allow the economic and the political development and growth that can follow as long as there is national reconciliation.
Very, very quick word, very quick, if you would. War is over? Yes, no?
Yeah, I think it's over. I think the government has to do something about these human rights activists who are being killed in the countryside. That has to be solved, because that could create a problem. Many of them have been killed and nothing has been done. I think the war is over, because I think the FARC are unlikely to go back to the weapon. So I think the future looks better than many people think.
No slight intended, but I'll leave the last word to our Colombian.
I think the violent conflict is over, and now the war should be against poverty and inequality.
Well, indeed, thank you all very much indeed. We've aired some pretty extensive issues in the course of just 30 minutes, and with those presidential elections coming up, expose some of the challenges that Colombia faces. But the consensus, I think, here is that progress is being made. Of course, there are millions and millions of people who were shot out of their homes, blown out of their homes, and dealing with them, the displaced in Colombia, is part of the reconciliation process. That's one of the main challenges. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for coming on the programme, and we hope to have your company next time. From me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team, goodbye for now.